Welcome to Listening History Sleepy. In the hours when darkness softens the boundaries between waking and dreaming, when consciousness begins its slow dissolution toward sleep, and the mind becomes receptive to voices that speak from depths of time so vast they seem almost geological, certain names rise from the dust of ancient Mesopotamia like smoke from altar fires that burned 5,000 years ago, and that have left only ash and memory and the faint trace of incense that once carried prayers toward heaven. Sumer. The word itself sounds ancient, carries weight of millennia, speaks of beginning rather than continuation, of invention rather than inheritance, of the moment when humans first organized themselves into cities and created writing and developed mathematics and astronomy and law codes, and all the apparatus of civilization that we take for granted, but that had to be created from nothing. Had to be imagined and implemented and refined over generations until the innovations became traditions and the experiments became established practices and what had been revolutionary became normal. The Sumerians lived in southern Mesopotamia, in the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, in what is now southern Iraq, in region that was not naturally hospitable to civilization. It had no stone for building, no trees for lumber, no metals for tools. Received little rainfall and would be desert without the rivers that flooded unpredictably, and that could bring fertility or destruction depending on their moods and depending on how successfully humans managed them through irrigation canals that were themselves engineering marvels, that required cooperation and organization, and the kind of social complexity that creates hierarchy and specialization, and eventually creates cities and states and empires. They emerged from prehistory around 4500 BCE, appearing in the archaeological record as people who built temples and created distinctive pottery and developed irrigation systems that allowed them to transform the marshlands and floodplains into agricultural heartland capable of supporting large populations. By 3500 BCE, they were building the first cities Uruk and and Eridu urban centers with populations in the tens of thousands, with monumental architecture that included ziggurats rising like artificial mountains from the flat landscape, with complex economies that required accounting systems that led directly to the invention of writing around 3200 BCE. This is not merely story of one civilization among many, though the Sumerians were indeed one civilization and not the only important culture of their time or their region. It is instead the story of the first cities, the first writing, the first literature, the first law codes, the first schools, the first documented instances of so many things that define what we mean by civilization that listing them becomes tedious even as the achievement they represent remains astonishing. The Sumerians were not more intelligent than their predecessors or their contemporaries in other regions, but they were situated in place and time that made innovation necessary and that rewarded innovation with survival and prosperity, that created conditions where the old ways were insufficient and where new solutions had to be developed. where the challenges of managing irrigation and organizing labor and coordinating trade pushed them toward creating the tools and institutions that would define urban civilization for millennia to come. As the night deepens and your breathing slows, let yourself drift toward ancient Sumer, toward the cities that rose from reed and mud brick, toward the temples where priests served gods who were believed to own the land and to require service from humans who had been created for that purpose. And toward the scribal schools where boys learned to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay and thereby joined the tiny literate elite who could read and write, and who preserved the voices that still speak to us across 5,000 years through tablets that have survived floods and fires, and the collapse of the civilization that created them. Let time dissolve as it dissolves in the moments before sleep claims us, and in that dissolution find the Sumer that existed before history as we understand it, before the written record that they invented, in the twilight between mythology and documentation, where we can glimpse the process through which humans transformed themselves from villagers to urbanites, from oral culture to literate culture, from prehistory to history. From the world that left no written traces to the world that speaks to us through clay tablets and cylinder seals, and the ruins of cities that proclaimed themselves eternal but that proved temporary like all human works, that fell and were covered by sand and were forgotten until archaeology recovered them and cuneiform was deciphered, and the Sumerian voices could be heard again. The journey begins not with kings or battles but with clay, with the humble material that was abundant in Mesopotamia, that could be shaped and that would harden, that could receive marks and preserve them, that became the medium through which thought could be made permanent, through which the ephemeral could become eternal, through which voices could speak beyond death and across millennia, through which the Sumerians could become not just archaeological culture whose artifacts we study but people whose words we read, whose thoughts we encounter, whose humanity we recognize in hymns and myths and administrative texts and personal letters that make them real to us in ways that cultures without writing can never be fully real, that make them speak to us rather than remaining silent, that make them present rather than merely past, that allow us to hear what they said about their gods and their cities and their lives and their deaths and their hopes and their fears and everything that mattered to them in the brief span of years between their births and their burials in the dust that now covers their cities and their temples and their bones. In the marshlands where the Tigris and Euphrates merge into 1,000 channels that wind through reed beds taller than a man, where the water is neither fully river nor fully sea but something intermediate, something that shifts with the seasons and with the floods that arrive unpredictably, and that can bring either abundance or disaster depending on their timing and their magnitude, the Sumerians pressed wedges into wet clay and created writing. It is said they began modestly, with marks that were not words but were symbols representing specific quantities of specific commodities: 7 jars of oil, 33 sheep, 14 measures of barley. Practical notation for merchants and temple administrators who needed to keep track of the goods that flowed in and out of the storehouses, who needed to record transactions and debts and the movement of resources that sustained the growing cities. The earliest tablets from around 3200 BCE are accounting documents, are economic texts that show us the unglamorous origins of writing, show us that literacy began not with poetry or philosophy but with bureaucracy, not with attempts to preserve religious revelation or literary achievement, but with the mundane necessity of tracking ownership and obligation, of creating records that would outlast human memory and that could be consulted later to verify what had been agreed. What had been delivered, what was owed. The symbols on these early tablets were pictographic. The sign for sheep looked like simplified sheep. The sign for barley looked like stylized grain, but they were also beginning to be abstracted, to be transformed from pictures into signs that represented sounds rather than things, that could be combined to write names and eventually to write any word that could be spoken. Beneath the silence of the scribal schools that would later be established to teach the cuneiform system that evolved from these early marks, we can sense the revolutionary transformation that was occurring even if those who were creating it did not fully understand its implications. Writing was a tool that allowed thought to be preserved beyond the life of the thinker, allowed communication across distances without requiring messengers to memorize and repeat messages verbatim, allowed records to be kept that could be consulted generations later, and that created continuity across time that oral cultures could not achieve, allowed the development of complex legal and economic and administrative systems that required documentation, allowed literature to be composed and preserved and transmitted, allowed the accumulation of knowledge in ways that transformed what was possible intellectually and culturally. The marks evolved over centuries, became increasingly abstract as the system developed, as the signs that had represented things came to represent sounds, as the rebus principle was discovered using the sign for arrow, which was pronounced T, to write the word for life, which was also pronounced T, allowing the script to represent any word regardless of whether it could be easily pictured. The wedge-shaped marks made by pressing reed stylus into clay at various angles gave the script its name cuneiform, from Latin cuneus meaning wedge, and gave it distinctive appearance that modern readers find exotic and beautiful even when they cannot read it, even when the meanings are inaccessible without years of specialized study. Where memory fades into the question of who exactly made the leap from accounting marks to full writing system, which scribe or which community of scribes recognized that the marks could represent sounds and that sounds could be combined to write any word, we find only silence. The invention was gradual rather than sudden, was process rather than eureka moment, emerged from the collective effort of many scribes working over several generations rather than from the inspiration of single genius. But the result was unmistakable. By 3000 BCE, the Sumerians possessed writing system capable of expressing the full range of human thought and observation, capable of recording not just economic transactions, but also royal inscriptions that proclaimed the achievements of kings, hymns that praised the gods, myths that explained the origins of the world and of humanity, law codes that established justice, omens that allowed priests to predict the future. Astronomical observations that tracked the movements of planets, mathematical problems and their solutions, medical prescriptions, personal letters, legal contracts, everything that humans needed or wanted to communicate. The clay tablets were paradoxically both fragile and durable. They could be broken easily, could dissolve in water if they were not properly baked, could crumble if not handled carefully. Yet when they were baked, whether intentionally in kilns or accidentally in the fires that destroyed the buildings where they were stored, they became nearly indestructible, became artifacts that could survive for millennia buried in the rubble of collapsed cities, that could withstand conditions that would have destroyed papyrus or parchment, that preserved the Sumerian voices with clarity that seems almost miraculous given the span of time that separates us from them. It is said that hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets have been recovered from Mesopotamian sites, that museums around the world hold collections that have been only partially published, that many tablets still await translation, that new texts are still being excavated, and that our understanding of Sumerian civilization continues to deepen as more material becomes available, and as our ability to read and interpret the texts improves. The clay that seemed so humble, so common, so unpromising as writing material proved to be ideal for preservation, proved to be medium that could carry voices across 5 millennia without significant degradation, proved to be foundation for the written record that makes Sumerian civilization accessible to us in ways that earlier non-literate cultures can never be accessible. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which exists in Sumerian versions and in later Akkadian translations, speaks to us still about friendship and mortality, and the search for immortality that all humans share, about the flood that destroyed the world and the survivor who preserved life, about the king who traveled to the ends of the earth seeking eternal life, and who learned that immortality cannot be achieved by mortals, but that fame can last beyond death if one's deeds are remembered. The epic was written on clay tablets, was copied and recopied across centuries, was preserved and transmitted through the care of scribes who understood that the story was worth preserving, that it spoke to something fundamental about human experience, that it deserved to outlast its original audience and its original cultural context. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the clay tablets speak still in museums and in the publications of Assyriologists who devote their careers to reading and translating and interpreting the wedge-shaped marks, who recover the Sumerian voices and who make them available to broader audiences who cannot read cuneiform themselves but who can read the translations, who can encounter the ancient texts and can recognize the humanity of those who wrote them. Who can see that the Sumerians 5,000 years ago were people like us, worried about their harvests and their debts, devoted to their gods and their families, fearful of death and hopeful for prosperity, living lives that were simultaneously different from ours in their specific details and identical to ours in their fundamental concerns. The clay that held the first words holds them still, preserved in the tablets that fill museums and that sit in storage waiting for scholars to study them, that contain texts that have not been read since the cities fell and the scribes died, and the knowledge of cuneiform was lost until the 19th century when scholars learned to decipher the script again, and the Sumerian voices could be heard after a silence of 2 millennia. The first words are accessible to us now, are readable, are translatable, are speakable, are present rather than lost, are voices rather than silence, are the clay speaking across time, carrying the marks that Sumerian scribes pressed into it, preserving what was written, testifying to what mattered, holding the first words that were written and that have been read and that will continue to be read as long as humans remember that writing began in Sumer, that the clay tablets are foundation of literacy, that the wedge-shaped marks are ancestors of all writing systems, that the Sumerians gave humanity the ability to speak beyond death, to communicate across millennia, to make thought permanent, to transform clay into voice, to create from mud and water and read stylus, the tool that would make history possible, that would make this conversation possible, that would allow me to write about them and you to read about them and all of us to remember that the clay holds the first words, holds them still. Holds them patiently, holds them eternally, waiting to be read, waiting to be heard, waiting to speak again as they speak now through the translations and the publications and the scholars who devote themselves to recovering what the clay holds, what the first words say, what the Sumerians pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago and what hardened into permanent record, into voice that speaks still, into the first words that were written, and that therefore made all subsequent writing possible. That made civilization as we understand it possible, that made the distance between then and now traversable, that made the Sumerians present to us, that made the clay speak. In the alluvial plain where no stone existed to quarry, where trees were scarce and had to be imported from distant mountains at great expense, where the materials available for building were limited to what could be grown in the marshes or shaped from the mud that the rivers deposited during their annual floods, the Sumerians created cities from reeds bundled together to form walls and roofs. From mud brick shaped by hand and dried in the sun until it was hard enough to stack into structures that rose higher than any structure in the region had risen before. From the determination to transform landscape into urban landscape, to impose human order on the chaos of the marshlands and the unpredictability of the rivers. Uruk, which may have been the world's first true city, emerged around 4000 BCE in southern Mesopotamia near the Euphrates, growing from farming village into urban center that by 3000 BCE covered more than 5 square kilometers and housed perhaps 50,000 people, a population density that was unprecedented, that required completely new forms of organization and administration. That demanded specialization of labor where some people grew food and others made pottery and others wove textiles and still others served as priests or scribes or administrators, where not everyone could know everyone else, where strangers lived side by side, where urban life created both opportunities and problems that village life had not presented. The city was organized around temples, massive structures that dominated the skyline and that served as economic and religious centers simultaneously. The White Temple at Uruk, built around 3200 BC, stood on platform raised 40 feet above the surrounding plain, accessed by monumental stairway, visible from great distances across the flat landscape, proclaiming through its elevation and its scale that this was sacred space, that the gods dwelt here, that the city was worthy of divine presence and divine protection. The temple was not merely place of worship, but was also a state that owned agricultural land and workshops, that employed thousands of people, that functioned as economic engine for the entire city, that collected offerings and rents and that redistributed resources through rations given to workers and through offerings given to the gods. Beneath the silence of the ruins that have been excavated at Uruk and at other Sumerian cities, and Eridu and Lagash and Nippur and Kish, we can reconstruct the urban landscape that the Sumerians created, can trace the street patterns and identify the residential quarters and the craft workshops and the administrative buildings, can see how the cities were organized and how they functioned, can recognize in their layouts the priorities and the values of those who built them. The temples were always at the center, were always the largest structures, demonstrated that religion was not separate sphere from economics or politics but was integrated with both, was foundation for entire social order. The cities were not eternal despite the aspirations of those who built them. They rose and fell, were destroyed by floods that broke through the levees and inundated the lower quarters, were sacked by enemies who breached the walls and burned the temples and carried away the cult statues, were abandoned when the rivers shifted their courses and the irrigation systems failed and the agricultural base that supported urban populations collapsed. But the cities were also rebuilt, were reoccupied, rose from their own ruins like phoenixes, created tells artificial mounds composed of the compressed ruins of multiple cities built one on top of another that rose higher with each iteration, that created hills in the flat landscape where no natural hills existed, that testified through their very form to the persistence of urban life, to the determination of humans to rebuild what had been destroyed. And to the cycle of rise and fall and rise again that characterized Mesopotamian history. It is said that the tells of Uruk and and the other Sumerian cities contain 20 or 30 or more occupation levels, represent thousands of years of continuous or near-continuous habitation, preserve archaeological record that documents the entire span of Mesopotamian civilization from its earliest beginnings to its final absorption into later empires. Each level contains the houses and the temples and the workshops and the graves of a generation or several generations, contains the pottery and the tools and the clay tablets that allow archaeologists to reconstruct how people lived, what they valued, how their society was organized, what changed over time, and what remained constant. Where memory fades into the daily experience of living in these first cities, of waking to the sound of donkeys and of merchants calling their wares and of children playing in the narrow streets, of smelling the bread baking and the beer brewing and the incense burning in the temples, of seeing the crowds and the strangers and the priests in their distinctive garments processing toward the ziggurats, of feeling simultaneously the excitement of urban life and the anonymity that cities create. The sense of being part of something larger than family or clan, but also the sense of being alone among thousands. We can imagine what it meant to be among the first urban humans, to be inventing city life as they lived it, to be creating the patterns and the institutions that would define urban existence for all subsequent civilizations. The cities required cooperation on unprecedented scale. The irrigation systems that provided water had to be maintained collectively, had to be managed so that upstream users did not monopolize the water at expense of downstream users, had to be defended against enemies who might cut the canals and destroy the crops, required administration and coordination and the development of political institutions that could organize collective action. The temples and the palaces that emerged as centers of power in Sumerian cities were responses to this need, were institutions that could mobilize labor for public works projects, that could settle disputes, that could represent the city in negotiations with other cities, that could provide leadership in war and in peace. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the cities speak through their ruins, through the mud brick walls that have eroded but that still show where buildings stood, through the street plans that can be traced, through the tells that rise like witnesses above the plain, through the artifacts that have been recovered from the collapsed buildings and the filled cisterns and the abandoned workshops, through the tablets that document economic transactions and legal decisions and religious practices, through everything that archaeology can recover and interpret and reconstruct. The cities that rose from reeds and mud speak of human ambition and human ingenuity, speak of the determination to create permanent settlements in landscape that seemed inhospitable to permanence, speak of the first urban experiment, of the invention of city life, of the transformation from village to metropolis, from kinship-based society to urban society where strangers lived together, and where new forms of organization were necessary. Where the old ways no longer worked and where innovation was rewarded with survival, where the cities that succeeded grew and prospered, and where the cities that failed were abandoned and were covered by sand and were forgotten until archaeologists recovered them, until the tells were excavated, until the mud brick was photographed and measured, until the street patterns were mapped, until the clay tablets were translated, until the voices could be heard again. Until the cities could speak about what they were and what they achieved and what they failed to achieve, until the reeds and mud that seemed so humble could be recognized as the materials from which civilization was built, from which the first cities rose, from which urban life began, from which we can trace the continuous line that connects ancient Uruk to modern cities, ancient Sumerian urbanites to us, the reed and mud brick to steel and concrete, the temples to skyscrapers, the first cities to all cities. The beginning to the present, the dust where the cities stood to the dust where they will stand again when we too have passed, when our cities too have become tells, when archaeologists of distant futures excavate our ruins and wonder about us as we wonder about the Sumerians, as we try to imagine what their cities were like, what it meant to live in the first cities, what voices spoke in the streets, what dreams were dreamed in the houses, what prayers were offered in the temples. What the reeds and mud became when Sumerian hands shaped them, what rose from the marshlands, what the cities were before they fell and became dust. The Sumerians believed their cities belonged not to humans but to gods who dwelt in the temples at the city's hearts, who owned the land and the people who worked it, who required service from humans who had been created, according to the Sumerian creation myths, specifically to relieve the gods of the burden of growing their own food and maintaining their own estates, who existed to serve divine masters in exchange for protection and prosperity and the continuation of cosmic order that made life possible. This was not metaphor or abstract theological concept, but was understood quite literally. The god Nana owned the city of and its agricultural lands. The goddess Inanna owned Uruk, the god Enki owned Eridu, and the temples were not symbols but were actual houses where the deities resided in the form of cult statues that were treated as living beings who needed to be fed and clothed and entertained and consulted about decisions affecting their cities. The ziggurat that stood at each city's center was the god's mountain, was artificial elevation that brought the divine dwelling closer to heaven, that created sacred geography in the flat landscape of Mesopotamia, where no natural mountains existed, but where the gods were believed to dwell on mountains, and therefore required mountains to be built for them. The ziggurat was not temple in the sense of place where worshippers gathered for communal worship that happened in other buildings adjacent to the ziggurat, but was rather the god's private residence, the most holy place that only priests could enter, where the cult statue resided in innermost chamber that was sanctuary separated from the profane world by multiple courtyards and gates and barriers that marked increasing levels of sacredness. That made the journey to the deity's presence into pilgrimage that transformed the pilgrim through the process of penetrating deeper into sacred space. Beneath the silence of the ziggurats that have been excavated, the one at that has been partially reconstructed, the foundations at Eridu and Uruk and Nippur that show their massive scale even in ruined state, we can sense what these structures meant to those who built them and who maintained them across centuries, who understood them as necessary infrastructure for relationship between human and divine realms, who believed that without proper houses the gods would not dwell among humans, and without divine presence the cities would lose their protection and their prosperity, and would fall to enemies or to natural disasters, or simply to the chaos that always threatened to overwhelm the ordered world. The relationship between humans and gods was contractual, was based on exchange rather than on unconditional love or grace. Humans provided service, they maintained the temples, they provided offerings of food and drink and precious materials, they performed rituals that pleased the gods and that maintained cosmic order, they fought wars to defend or extend the gods' territories, they obeyed the laws that the gods had established through their earthly representatives who were the kings and the priests. In exchange, the gods provided protection from enemies and from natural disasters, ensured abundant harvests through proper management of the floods, maintained justice through the law codes they inspired, granted victory in warfare when the cause was just or when the offerings had been sufficient. But the gods were not entirely reliable, were not bound by human understanding of justice or fairness, had their own conflicts and alliances and jealousies that could result in innocent cities being destroyed or righteous kings being overthrown. The gods were powerful but not omnipotent, were immortal but not unchanging, had personalities and preferences that made them unpredictable, that required careful attention and constant propitiation. That made divination essential, the practice of reading omens in the livers of sacrificed animals, or in the movements of oil on water, or in the patterns of smoke rising from incense, or in celestial phenomena that revealed divine intentions, and that allowed priests to advise kings about when to plant crops or wage wars or undertake building projects. It is said that the gods required feeding through daily offerings that were presented in elaborate rituals, the morning meal and the evening meal, and the special feasts on festival days when the deities' hunger and thirst were believed to be greater, when the offerings had to be proportionally larger to maintain divine favor. The food that was offered to the gods was not destroyed or thrown away, but was redistributed after the ritual to the priests and to the temple personnel, creating economic system where religious service was literally supported by the gods' leftovers, where serving in the temple meant receiving rations from the offerings, where the theology of divine ownership translated into practical system for supporting religious and administrative elite. Where memory fades into the question of whether the Sumerians actually believed that the statues ate the food, or whether they understood the rituals as symbolic, whether the theology was taken literally by everyone or whether there were levels of interpretation ranging from literal belief among the common people to more sophisticated understanding among the educated elite. We find that the sources generally present the beliefs as straightforward. The gods were present in their statues. The statues were alive in some sense. The food was consumed even if the mechanism was not physically visible. The relationship was real even if it operated according to principles that transcended ordinary material causation. The priests who served in the temples were not merely religious officials, but were estate managers who controlled vast economic resources, who administered agricultural lands that belonged to the temples, who supervised workshops where textiles were woven and pottery was made and metal objects were crafted, who kept detailed accounts on clay tablets that document every aspect of temple economy: how much grain was harvested from which fields, how many sheep were born and sheared and slaughtered, how much wool was distributed to which workers, what wages were paid to laborers and artisans and administrators. The temples were not separate from the economy but were integral to it, were major landowners and employers, were centers of production and redistribution, demonstrated that in Sumerian civilization the sacred and the economic were not distinct spheres but were deeply interconnected, were dimensions of single system. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the gods speak through the hymns that praised them, through the myths that told their stories, through the rituals that served them, through the temples that housed them, through the entire apparatus of Sumerian religion that has been preserved in clay tablets and in archaeological remains. The gods who walked through ziggurat gates or who were believed to walk through them, or who were invoked and honored and feared as if they walked through them, shaped Sumerian civilization in profound ways, provided the cosmological framework within which everything else operated, gave meaning to the labor and the suffering and the achievements of human life, made the cities sacred, made agriculture sacred, made kingship sacred, made everything that mattered into service to the divine. The ziggurat at Ur that was rebuilt by King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE still stands in partially reconstructed form. Its mud brick core exposed where the outer facing has eroded, its massive scale still impressive even in ruin, its presence still commanding attention even after 4,000 years, testifying to the devotion and the resources that the Sumerians invested in creating proper dwellings for their gods, in building mountains where no mountains existed, in making sacred space that would connect earth and heaven, human and divine, the temporal and the eternal. The gods no longer receive their daily meals, no longer have priests to maintain their temples and interpret their will, no longer exercise the power over human affairs that the Sumerians believed they possessed, no longer walk through ziggurat gates or any gates at all, except in the imaginations of those who study ancient Mesopotamian religion and who try to understand what these beliefs meant to those who held them. How they shaped daily life and political decisions and artistic expressions and everything else that constituted Sumerian culture. The silence of the abandoned temples is silence of absent gods, is silence that speaks of the mortality not just of civilizations but of the divine beings who were believed to sustain them, of the recognition that when the worshippers disappear the gods disappear with them, that divinity without devotion is like fire without fuel, it simply ceases to exist except as memory, as mythology, as texts that preserve beliefs that no one believes anymore. As temples that house statues that have been removed to museums or destroyed, as ziggurats that stand empty. But the gods shaped what the Sumerians built and how they organized their society and what they valued and what they feared, shaped the cities that rose around their temples, shaped the agriculture that was understood as service to divine landowners, shaped the writing that began as temple accounting and evolved into literature that praised the gods and told their stories, shaped everything that made Sumerian civilization distinctive, everything that survives in the archaeological record and in the texts. Everything that allows us to hear Sumerian voices and to understand Sumerian worldview, everything that connects us across 5 millennia to people who believed that the gods walked through ziggurat gates, who built the gates for that purpose, who maintained them carefully, who brought offerings faithfully, who organized their entire civilization around service to the divine, who created from reeds and mud and religious devotion the first great urban culture, the first civilization that speaks to us through writing. The first voices from the dust that tell us not just what happened but what it meant, not just what was built but why it was built, not just how people lived but what they believed about why they lived, what purposes they served, what gods they served, what gates the gods walked through, what sacred space they created, what connection they maintained between earth and heaven, between human and divine, between the dust where the cities stood and the heights where the gods were believed to dwell. Between the silence and the voice, between the absence and the presence, between then and now, between the Sumerians who built ziggurats for their gods and us who study the ruins and who wonder what it meant to believe so completely, to serve so faithfully, to build so monumentally for beings who existed perhaps only in imagination but who shaped reality nonetheless, who were real in their effects even if not real in themselves, who walked through gates or who were believed to walk through gates, and whose walking shaped everything. In the Sumerian king list, a document that purports to record all the rulers from the time when kingship first descended from heaven until the compiler's own era, arranged in dynasties that succeeded one another in what was probably idealized rather than strictly historical sequence, there appears at a certain point the laconic statement that has resonated through millennia. Then the flood swept over. Before the flood, the list records impossibly long reigns kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. Ululim who reigned for 28,800 years at Eridu, Dumuzid who was shepherd and who reigned for 36,000 years at Bad Tabira, numbers that clearly belong to mythological time rather than to historical chronology, that suggest an age when humans or proto-humans or divine human hybrids lived lifespans that dwarfed our threescoring. That inhabited world where the boundaries between mortal and immortal were more permeable than they later became. After the flood, the reign lengths become more plausible even if still exaggerated kings ruling for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, numbers that suggest transition from mythic past to historical present, from the age of legends to the age of men, from the time when gods walked openly among humans to the time when divine contact required intermediaries and rituals and temples. The flood marks the boundary, marks the moment when everything changed, when the old world was destroyed and new world emerged from the waters, when humanity was nearly wiped out and had to rebuild from survivors who preserved knowledge and skills, but who inhabited fundamentally different reality than their ancestors had inhabited. The flood story appears in multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero, after wandering through the wilderness and crossing the waters of death, finally reaches Utnapishtim, the human who survived the flood and who was granted immortality by the gods as reward for his service in preserving life. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story that has become one of the most famous narratives from ancient Mesopotamia. How the gods decided to destroy humanity through a flood, how the wise god warned Utnapishtim in a dream, how Utnapishtim built a boat according to divine specifications, square rather than ship-shaped, 7 decks high, loaded with treasures and animals and craftsmen, and his own family, how the rains came and the dikes were breached, and the water rose until it covered the mountains. How even the gods were terrified by the destruction they had unleashed and huddled like dogs against the walls of heaven. Beneath the silence of whether there was actual catastrophic flood that became basis for these stories, or whether the narratives reflect cumulative memory of many floods compressed into archetypal single event, we find that archaeological evidence shows flood layers at various Mesopotamian sites at Ur and at Uruk and at other cities, but the layers are not synchronous, do not represent single flood that inundated entire region, but rather represent local floods that occurred at different times. That demonstrate that flooding was constant threat in Mesopotamia, where the rivers were unpredictable, and where the levees could fail, and where the cities built on the floodplain were vulnerable to inundation that could come suddenly, and that could destroy crops and buildings and lives with terrifying efficiency. The Sumerian version of the flood story, older than the Akkadian versions in Gilgamesh, names the hero Ziusudra and describes how he was warned by the god Enki, how he built a boat and survived while humanity was destroyed, how he offered sacrifice after the flood receded, and how the gods gave him eternal life and placed him in Dilmun, the paradise at the edge of the world where the sun rises. The story is fragmentary, the tablet that preserves it is broken, and much of the text is lost, but enough survives to show that the flood tradition was ancient in Mesopotamia, was embedded in Sumerian culture, and was passed on to later cultures that inherited and adapted it. Where memory fades into the question of why the gods sent the flood, what offense humanity had committed that merited total destruction, the texts give various answers or no answer at all. In some versions, humans had become too noisy, had disturbed the gods' rest, had multiplied until their voices were like swarm of locusts that prevented the gods from sleeping. In other versions, the reason is not specified, or the section of the tablet that would have explained it is broken and lost. The arbitrariness is itself noteworthy. The flood was not necessarily divine justice responding to human wickedness, but might be divine annoyance responding to human existence, might be disaster that was disproportionate to any offense, might be capricious decision by gods who were powerful but not necessarily just. The biblical Noah story that appears in Genesis is clearly related to the Mesopotamian traditions, shares too many specific details to be independent development, the divine warning, the boat built to save remnant, the animals preserved in pairs or in sevens, the sending out of birds to test whether water has receded, the sacrifice after landing, the divine promise that such destruction will not be repeated. The discovery of the Mesopotamian flood stories in the 19th century, when cuneiform was being deciphered, created theological crisis for those who believed in the unique divine inspiration of the biblical text, demonstrated that the Bible shared material with pagan sources, that the flood story was not unique revelation, but was common Near Eastern tradition that Israel had inherited and adapted. It is said that the flood became every flood, that the archetypal story absorbed and represented all the local floods and personal disasters and collective traumas that humans experienced, that it became symbol of destruction and survival, of the end of the world and the continuation of the world, of the moment when everything is lost and the moment when enough is preserved to rebuild. The flood was both historical memory and mythological archetype, was both specific event or events and universal human fear of the deluge, the inundation, the waters rising until they cover everything, until only the sky remains visible above the flood and even the sky is gray with rain. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the flood speaks through the texts that preserve its memory, through the tablets that tell how Utnapishtim or Ziusudra survived, through the Epic of Gilgamesh that uses the flood story to explore questions about mortality and immortality, through the biblical Noah narrative that transforms the Mesopotamian tradition into Hebrew theology, through all the retellings and adaptations and interpretations that have accumulated over millennia. Through the recognition that the flood is more than historical event or mythological fiction, but is foundational narrative, is story that shapes how cultures understand catastrophe and survival, destruction and preservation, the end of the world and the world after the end. The flood that swept over in the Sumerian king list swept over the entire ancient Near East, swept into biblical tradition, swept into Islamic tradition where Noah is prophet warning his people, swept into countless retellings where the details change but the core remains the warning, the boat, the rising waters, the survivors, the new beginning. The flood that became every flood speaks of how stories transcend their origins, how narratives become archetypes, how the Sumerian experience of living with unpredictable rivers became universal story about divine judgment and human survival, about the waters that destroy and the ark that preserves, about the old world drowned and the new world emerging from the receding flood. About Ziusudra and Utnapishtim and Noah and all the unnamed survivors of all the floods that have swept over cities and civilizations. About the dust that turns to mud when the waters rise, about the mud that dries back to dust when the waters fall, about the silence after the flood when the dead are buried in the silt, and the survivors count what has been lost and what has been preserved, about the memory that carries forward the story of the flood even when the flood itself has dried and disappeared. Even when only the story remains, only the voice speaking from clay tablets, only the recognition that we are all survivors of floods that swept over our ancestors, that the survival is gift, that the story is inheritance, that the flood that destroyed also preserved by making the story necessary, by making the memory urgent, by making the telling essential, by making the flood that swept over become the flood that speaks still, that echoes still, that reminds us still that the waters can rise. That destruction can come, that survival is not guaranteed but is achievement, that the ark must be built even when the sky is clear, that the warning must be heeded even when the flood seems impossible, that the story must be told even when the flood is ancient history, must be preserved in clay and in memory, and in the retelling that makes the flood present, that makes Ziusudra speak to us, That makes the Sumerian king list relevant millennia after the last Sumerian king died. That makes the flood that swept over sweep over us as well, as story, as memory, as archetype, as the voice from the dust saying, "The flood came, the flood destroyed, the flood receded, the survivors rebuilt, the story was preserved, the voice still speaks. The silence remembers the roar of the waters, the dust remembers the mud. The clay tablets remember the flood that swept over and that sweeps over still in every retelling, every flood, every catastrophe, every ending and every beginning, every destruction and every survival, every voice that speaks from the dust and says, 'And this is what happened, this is how we survived, this is the story that must be told.'" The Sumerian kings existed in the liminal space between human and divine, were mortal men who ruled by divine mandate but who participated in rituals that made them temporarily or partially divine, who were described in royal inscriptions with epithets that attributed to them superhuman qualities and divine favor, while also acknowledging implicitly or explicitly their eventual deaths, and their need for successors who would continue the dynasty and the divine mandate it embodied. The king was shepherd of the people, was chosen by the gods to ensure justice and prosperity, was responsible for maintaining the temples and the irrigation systems and the walls that protected the cities, was military leader who defended against enemies and who extended territory when opportunity arose, was judge who heard disputes and who established laws, was builder who created monuments that would testify to his piety and his power. But the king was also husband of the goddess, participated in sacred marriage ritual that was performed annually during New Year festival. That involved the king taking the role of the god Dumuzi and ritually mating with priestess representing Inanna. That was believed to ensure fertility for the coming year, fertility of the fields and fertility of the flocks and fertility of women who wanted children. The sacred marriage was not merely symbolic but was understood to have real effect, was necessary for maintaining cosmic order and for ensuring that the natural cycles would continue, that the rains would come and the rivers would flood at appropriate times and in appropriate measures, that chaos would be held at bay, and order would be maintained through the ritual that connected heaven and earth through the bodies of the king and the priestess. The royal tombs at Ur, excavated by British archaeologist Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, revealed something that shocked the archaeological world and that continues to disturb those who study ancient Mesopotamia. Elaborate death pits where dozens of attendants had been buried with the king or queen, had been dressed in their finest clothing and jewelry, had been arranged in orderly rows suggesting they had not died struggling or fleeing but had been positioned deliberately, had presumably drunk poison or had been killed in some way that left their skeletons intact and properly arranged, had gone to their deaths to accompany their ruler into the afterlife where they would continue to serve as they had served in life. Beneath the silence of the death pits where the bones lie in eternal service, where the lapis lazuli and gold jewelry still adorns the skeletons, where the lyres and the games and the weapons that were buried with them testify to the belief that afterlife would require the same material culture as earthly life, we can contemplate the worldview that made such sacrifices seem necessary or appropriate. That saw death not as ending but as transition to realm where the social hierarchies and the power structures of this world would continue, where the king would need servants to attend him and musicians to entertain him and soldiers to guard him, where the dead required the same apparatus of civilization that the living required. Where memory fades into the question of whether the attendants went willingly or were coerced, whether they considered it honor to be selected for this service or whether they were victims of system that gave them no choice, whether they believed they were continuing their relationship with beloved ruler or whether they simply had no agency in the matter, we find that the archaeology cannot answer these questions, that the bones are silent about the consciousness that inhabited them. That we can only speculate based on our own assumptions and values about what must have been experienced by those who walked down into the death pits, and who lay down in their assigned positions, and who drank or accepted the death that had been determined for them. The death pit designated PG 789 at contained 74 bodies, 6 men, and 68 women, along with 2 lyres and various tools and weapons and jewelry. The women wore elaborate headdresses of gold and lapis lazuli, had gold earrings, were dressed in fine garments whose textiles have decayed but whose ornamentation remains. They were arranged in rows, some in the main chamber and others in the entrance passage, creating procession of the dead that followed the royal burial into eternity. The care taken with their burial, the value of the objects interred with them, suggests that they were valued attendants rather than mere slaves, suggests that their service was honored even as their lives were terminated, creates disturbing paradox of respect and violence intertwined. It is said that human sacrifice in Mesopotamia was not common practice, was exceptional rather than normal, was associated specifically with royal burials, and primarily in the early dynastic period around 26,002,500 BCE, and that it was abandoned in later periods when kings continued to be buried with great wealth, but without the attendants who had been killed to accompany earlier rulers. This suggests that even within Sumerian culture the practice was controversial, or that it was recognized as excessive, or that the theology that justified it was questioned and eventually rejected, that there was development and change rather than static tradition, that what seemed necessary or appropriate at one time was reconsidered and abandoned at later time. The kings who were divine and mortal both embodied the ambiguity that characterized Sumerian theology, the recognition that humans and gods were not absolutely separated, but existed on continuum where the boundaries could be crossed in certain circumstances, where the king through ritual could participate in divine nature, where mortality could be transcended not through individual immortality, which even Gilgamesh could not achieve, but through dynastic continuity. That through creating works that would outlast the individual life, through being remembered through inscriptions and through hymns that would keep the name alive even after the body had been buried and the flesh had decayed and only bones remained. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the kings speak through the inscriptions they commissioned, through the law codes they promulgated, through the temples they built, through the tombs where they were buried, through the attendants who died with them, through everything that testifies to their power and to their mortality, to their divine mandate and to their human limitations, to their achievements and to their deaths, to their names preserved in king lists and to their bodies reduced to dust. To the voice that proclaims eternal glory, and to the silence that acknowledges that eternity belongs only to the gods and that even divine kings must die, must be buried, must become memory rather than presence, must speak through inscriptions rather than speaking directly, must rely on clay tablets to preserve what they said and what they did and what they claimed to be, must trust that future generations will read their words and will remember their names and will recognize that they were both divine and mortal. Both shepherds and servants, both powerful and vulnerable, both kings who commanded armies and men who died, both voices that still speak and silence that waits to reclaim all voices, both the dust that was shaped into glory and the dust that reclaims all shapes, both the kings who ruled Sumer and the bones that lie in death pits beneath the tells where their cities stood, both the memory that preserves and the forgetting that threatens, both the inscription that proclaims and the erosion that effaces. Both the name that echoes and the silence where the echo fades, both the kings and the dust, both the divine and the mortal, both at once, forever ambiguous, forever paradoxical, forever speaking from tombs about power and about death, about glory and about bones, about divinity and about the mortality that even divine kings cannot escape, cannot transcend, can only acknowledge and accept and face with the dignity that their position requires, and that the death pits testify they faced. Taking their attendants with them into the silence, into the dust, into the death where all kings go regardless of their divine pretensions, regardless of their sacred marriages, regardless of the hymns that praise them, regardless of the inscriptions that promise eternal memory, regardless of everything except the simple fact that they were mortal, that they died, that their bones lie in the dust where their cities stood. That their voices speak only through clay tablets that preserve what they said when they were alive, and that speak for them now that they are dead, now that they are dust, now that only the memory remains, only the inscriptions remain, only the tombs remain, only the silence remains where the voices once spoke. Only the dust remains where the kings once ruled. Only the clay tablets remain to testify that the kings who were divine and mortal both were real, were here, built cities, ruled empires, died, were buried. Became dust, became silence, became voices speaking from silence, became kings speaking from dust. The wedge-shaped marks that began as a counting system for tracking sheep and barley and jars of oil evolved over centuries into script capable of expressing the full range of human thought and observation, capable of recording not just the mundane transactions of temple economy, but also the movements of Venus across the night sky, the calculations that predicted eclipses decades in advance, the medical prescriptions that described symptoms and remedies. The legal decisions that established precedents for resolving disputes, the royal inscriptions that proclaimed achievements and claimed divine favor, the mythological narratives that explained how the world came to be and how humans fit into cosmic order, the love songs and the lamentations and the hymns and the wisdom literature and everything that humans needed or wanted to preserve, everything that seemed worth writing down, everything that deserved to outlast the moment of its speaking. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers, created administrative texts in quantities that stagger imagination. Hundreds of thousands of tablets have been recovered from Mesopotamian sites, and many more remain buried or have been destroyed over millennia. Tablets that documented every aspect of temple and palace economy with precision that seems almost neurotic, that recorded how much grain was harvested from which fields and in which year, how many sheep were born and died and were sheared and were slaughtered for meat, how much wool was distributed to which workers and what they produced from it, what rations were given to laborers based on their age and gender and the type of work they performed, creating archive of daily life that is unparalleled in the ancient world, and that allows historians to reconstruct Sumerian economy and society with detail that would be impossible without this written record. Beneath the silence of the scribal schools where young boys and occasionally girls, though the scribal profession was overwhelmingly male, learned to form the wedge-shaped marks, where they began with simple signs and progressed through copying exercises and mathematical problems and literary texts, until they could write fluently and could join the small literate elite who served in temples and palaces, who kept the records and wrote the letters and composed the inscriptions, who were respected and relatively well paid and who had access to knowledge and to power that illiteracy precluded. We can sense the transformation that literacy created, the division it established between those who could read and write and those who could not, the way it concentrated power in the hands of those who controlled the records and who could verify or falsify accounts, who could prove or disprove claims about what had been agreed or what had been delivered. But the cuneiform tablets served higher purposes beyond economic accounting, documented human observation of the heavens with precision that would not be matched until the scientific revolution millennia later. The Sumerian and later Babylonian astronomers tracked Venus's appearances and disappearances, noting when the morning star became visible before sunrise and when the evening star appeared after sunset, recognizing that these were the same celestial body and that its movements followed regular cycle that could be predicted, that could be correlated with earthly events, and that could be used to create calendar that aligned human activities with cosmic rhythms. The astronomical observations that were recorded on clay tablets spanning centuries allowed the accumulation of data that made prediction possible. That showed that what seemed chaotic was actually ordered, that the movements of planets followed patterns that repeated over long periods, that eclipses that seemed ominous and unpredictable could actually be forecast if one had sufficient observations and sufficient mathematical skill to analyze them. The Babylonian astronomers who inherited and expanded Sumerian knowledge developed mathematical techniques for predicting planetary positions years in advance, created tables that showed where Venus or Jupiter or Saturn would be on specific dates in the future, demonstrated mastery of observational astronomy and mathematical calculation that would influence Greek astronomy, and that would eventually contribute to the scientific traditions that created modern astronomy. Where memory fades into the question of how much Sumerian astronomical knowledge was driven by pure curiosity and how much was driven by religious necessity, by the need to predict eclipses that were interpreted as omens, by the desire to understand divine will as expressed through celestial phenomena, by the belief that the movements of planets influenced events on Earth, and that understanding those movements allowed priests to advise kings about when to plant or harvest or wage war, we find that the distinction between religious astronomy and scientific astronomy is anachronistic. That for the Sumerians and Babylonians, the observation of the heavens and the interpretation of their meanings were parts of single integrated practice, were dimensions of the same effort to understand cosmic order and to align human activities with that order. The mathematical tablets demonstrate Sumerian proficiency with calculations that included multiplication and division, square roots and cube roots, geometric problems involving areas and volumes, algebraic problems that would not look out of place in modern textbooks even if the notation and the methods were different from what we use today. The Sumerians developed base 60 mathematical system sexagesimal system that gives us the 60 minute hour and the 360-degree circle, and the division of the degree into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds system that was better suited than base 10 for dealing with fractions because 60 is divisible by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30, allowing many common fractions to be expressed as whole numbers of 60ths. It is said that the scribal education emphasized both practical skills and literary culture, that students learned not just how to keep accounts but also how to copy the classics of Sumerian literature, that they memorized proverbs and practiced writing letters and studied word lists that preserved vocabulary, and that functioned as bilingual dictionaries once Akkadian became the spoken language and Sumerian became classical language known only through scribal training. The education created shared culture among literate elite, gave them common reference points and common texts, made them part of tradition that extended back centuries and that connected them to the great scribes of the past and to the literary works that defined Sumerian civilization. The cuneiform that counted stars and grain counted both with equal precision, treated the movements of Venus and the rations of barley workers as equally deserving of careful record, demonstrated that for the Sumerians the sacred and the mundane were not separate spheres but were interconnected dimensions of single reality, that the same script that documented economic transactions could document astronomical observations, that the same mathematics that calculated areas of fields could calculate positions of planets, that the wedge-shaped marks were a versatile tool that could be adapted to record anything that humans deemed worth recording, Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the cuneiform tablets speak in the hundreds of thousands, speak from museums and from storerooms and from excavations that continue to recover them from the tells where Sumerian cities stood, speak in the translations that scholars publish and in the databases that catalog them, and in the ongoing work of decipherment that continues because many tablets remain unpublished, untranslated, unread since they were written 5,000 years ago or 4,000 years ago or 3,000 years ago. Waiting for scholars to read them, waiting for the wedge-shaped marks to yield their meanings, waiting to speak again after millennia of silence. The tablets that counted stars documented observations, recorded when Venus rose and set, noted unusual celestial phenomena, created archive of data that allowed patterns to be recognized and predictions to be made. That demonstrated that the heavens were not chaotic but were ordered, that the gods who controlled the heavens operated according to principles that could be understood through patient observation and careful calculation. That divination was not arbitrary interpretation, but was systematic science based on correlations between celestial events and terrestrial outcomes that had been observed and recorded over centuries. The tablets that counted grain documented the foundation of Sumerian economy, recorded the harvest yields and the distributions and the consumption, created accountability that made temple administration possible, that allowed resources to be managed efficiently, that prevented or detected theft and fraud, that made complex urban economy function through record-keeping that preserved information beyond the limits of human memory. That allowed verification of claims and resolution of disputes and planning for future based on past performance. The cuneiform that counted both was single system, was unified script that demonstrated Sumerian understanding that the cosmos was integrated whole, that the movements of planets and the distribution of rations were both part of divine order that required maintenance, that both deserved to be recorded with precision, that both mattered. The stars and the grain were not opposites but were complementary, were different manifestations of the order that made life possible, that made civilization possible, that made the cities rise and the temples stand and the irrigation systems function and the harvests yield and the economy sustain the population that depended on it. The wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago still speak, still count, still document, still preserve the voices of those who wrote them and the observations they recorded and the calculations they performed and the knowledge they accumulated, still testify to Sumerian intellectual achievement, still demonstrate that the first civilization was also sophisticated civilization, that the people who invented writing also used it brilliantly. That the cuneiform that began as a counting system became tool for understanding the cosmos, that the stars and the grain were both counted, both recorded, both preserved in clay that hardened into permanent testimony to Sumerian precision, Sumerian curiosity, Sumerian determination to document and to understand and to preserve, to make knowledge permanent, to allow thought to transcend the thinker, to count stars and grain with equal care. and to press marks into clay that would speak across millennia about what the Sumerians observed, and what they calculated, and what they understood about the order of the cosmos and the management of resources. About Venus rising and barley harvests, about the heavens and the earth, about the sacred and the mundane, about everything that cuneiform could count, could record, could preserve, could make permanent, could transform from thought into mark, from observation into text, from ephemeral into eternal. And from voice into silence that speaks, from the dust into the clay tablets that hold the dust's voice, that make the dust speak about stars and grain, about what was counted and what was recorded and what the counting meant, what the recording achieved, what the cuneiform preserved. What speaks still in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay by Sumerian hands that have been dust for 5 millennia, but that shaped the clay that speaks still, that counted still, that preserves still the stars and the grain. The cosmos and the economy, the observations and the accounts, the knowledge and the record, the voice and the silence, the marks and the meaning, the cuneiform that counted everything that mattered and that preserved everything it counted, that speaks still, that counts still, that waits still to be read, to be translated, to be understood, to reveal what the Sumerians knew about stars and grain and everything between. In Sumerian culture, beer was not recreational beverage consumed occasionally for pleasure, but was staple food consumed daily by all classes, was source of nutrition and calories that made up significant portion of diet, was safer to drink than water that might be contaminated by the waste of densely populated cities, was currency used to pay workers who received rations measured in quantities of beer along with bread and other provisions. Was offering given to gods who required feeding just as humans required feeding and who were pleased by beer just as humans were pleased by it, was medicine that could treat various ailments, was social lubricant that facilitated gatherings and conversations and business transactions, was integral to Sumerian life in ways that modern beer consumption cannot match, in ways that made beer not luxury but necessity, not indulgence but foundation. The hymn to Ninkasi, goddess of beer who was daughter of Enki the god of wisdom, and of Ninti whose name meant lady of the rib or lady who makes live, is simultaneously religious text that praises the deity and brewing recipe that describes in poetic language the process of making beer from barley bread called bapir that was baked specifically for brewing, that was soaked in water in large vessels, that fermented through natural yeasts that were present in the air or on the grain, that was strained to remove the solids, that was stored in jars and consumed using long straws made from reeds that allowed the drinker to sip the liquid from below the surface where sediment and chaff floated, that created communal drinking experience where multiple straws might project from single large jar, and where drinking was social activity rather than solitary consumption. Beneath the silence of the beer houses that no longer exist except in archaeological traces and in the texts that mention them, where both men and women could drink though the establishments were often run by women, and where reputation could be dubious depending on what other activities occurred alongside the drinking, where business was conducted and news was exchanged, and where the boundaries between respectable and disreputable were negotiated. We can imagine the centrality of beer to Sumerian social life, the way that drinking connected people to each other and to the gods, the way that beer created temporary equality even in hierarchical society, the way that the fermentation seemed magical barley and water transformed into something different, something that altered consciousness, something that created joy or at least relief from the burdens of labor and mortality. The brewing was typically women's work, was domestic activity that had religious dimensions because Ninkasi was goddess and because making beer was honoring her and participating in the creative transformation that she presided over. The hymn describes the process. Ninkasi, you are the one who soaks the malt in a jar, the waves rise, the waves fall. You are the one who spreads the cooked mash on large reed mats, coolness overcomes. You are the one who holds with both hands the great sweet wort, brewing it with honey and wine. The language is sensual, celebrates the physical process of brewing, makes the labor into liturgy, transforms the mundane into sacred. Where memory fades into the taste of Sumerian beer, into whether it was sweet or sour or bitter, whether it was thick or thin, whether it was alcoholic enough to intoxicate or was mostly nutritional beverage with mild alcohol content. We find that modern brewers have attempted to recreate ancient beer based on the recipes preserved in hymns and on the analysis of residues found in ancient vessels, have produced beverages that are unlike modern beers, that are often described as sour or funky, that contain dates or honey for sweetness, that are unfiltered and cloudy, that must be drunk through straws because of the sediment, that give some approximation of what Sumerians drank, though we can never be certain we have recreated it exactly. It is said that beer was democratizing beverage, rich and poor both drank it, though the quality varied, and the wealthy drank from finer vessels and perhaps drank beer that had been brewed more carefully, or that had been flavored with more expensive additives, and that beer consumption created shared experience across social classes, created moments when the hierarchies that structured Sumerian society were temporarily relaxed, when workers and their supervisors might drink from the same jar. When the beer created fellowship that transcended status, when Ninkasi blessed all who honored her through drinking what she had taught humans to make. The Code of Hammurabi, though from later Babylonian period rather than from Sumerian period proper, contains laws regulating beer houses and beer prices, demonstrating that beer commerce required legal framework, that disputes arose over quality and quantity, that beer sellers who were often women could be punished for cheating customers by watering down beer or by using false measures, could be drowned as punishment for certain offenses, suggesting that beer was serious business and that its importance to society required regulation and enforcement, required laws that would protect consumers and that would maintain standards. The beer rations that workers received were calculated based on their status, and their labor higher status workers received more beer. Workers performing heavy labor received more beer than those performing light labor. Adult workers received more than children, creating differentiated system, but one that guaranteed that everyone received some beer, that access to beer was right rather than privilege. That the beer flowed from temple storehouses to the workers who had produced the grain that had been brewed into beer, creating cycle where labor produced grain, grain was brewed into beer, beer was distributed as rations, rations sustained labor that produced more grain, completing the cycle that sustained Sumerian civilization. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the beer speaks through the hymn to Ninkasi, through the ration lists that document distributions, through the laws that regulated beer houses, through the vessels that have been excavated from Sumerian sites and that show wear patterns consistent with drinking through straws, through everything that testifies to beer's centrality to Sumerian life, to its role in economy and religion and social interaction, to the way it sustained bodies and pleased gods and created community. And to the fermentation that was transformation, to the goddess who presided over the transformation and who was honored through the drinking, to the recognition that beer was not peripheral but was foundational, was not luxury but was necessity, was not indulgence but was infrastructure, was part of what made civilization possible by providing nutrition and hydration and calories and pleasure, by creating reason to gather and to share, by demonstrating that barley could become more than bread. That water could become more than water, that transformation was possible and was daily occurrence, that magic was real if magic meant fermentation, meant the natural processes through which grain and water became beer. The beer that made civilization possible made it possible by making life bearable, by providing relief from labor, by creating moments of joy or at least of reduced suffering, by giving workers something to look forward to at the end of the day, by making the rations that sustained them include not just calories but also pleasure, by demonstrating that civilization could provide not just survival but enhancement, not just existence but experience, not just subsistence but satisfaction. The beer flowed through Sumerian society like the irrigation water flowed through the fields, sustaining and nourishing, creating fertility and abundance, making possible what would not have been possible without it, making civilization not just organized survival but culture, not just hierarchy and labor but also celebration and fellowship, not just the dust of daily toil but also the fermented joy of beer drunk with companions, of beer offered to gods, of beer honoring Ninkasi. Of beer making civilization possible one cup at a time, one jar at a time, one brewing at a time, one hymn at a time, one sip through reed straw at a time, one moment of relief at a time, one transformation of grain into something more than grain at a time, one act of creation at a time, one small miracle at a time, until the accumulated miracles created civilization, created culture, created the conditions under which humans could do more than merely survive. Could build cities and write on clay and observe the stars and create literature and law and everything that makes the Sumerians worth remembering, everything that makes their voices worth hearing, everything that the beer made possible by sustaining them, by nourishing them, by pleasing them, by giving them reason to honor Ninkasi. And to brew and to drink and to share and to gather and to speak and to remember and to record in hymns that preserved the knowledge of brewing and the praise of the goddess and the recognition that beer was sacred gift. was foundation of civilization, was what made everything else possible, was the fermented barley that sustained the workers who built the temples and dug the canals and wrote the tablets and created everything that speaks to us now from the dust where Sumer stood, where beer flowed. Where Ninkasi was honored, where civilization was made possible one beer at a time. Sumerian women occupied positions in society that would seem remarkable when compared to many later civilizations that restricted women's roles more severely, that made women's participation in public life scandalous or impossible, that confined women to domestic sphere and denied them access to property ownership and to legal autonomy and to the professions that men monopolized. The Sumerian women could own property in their own names, could buy and sell real estate and slaves and other goods, could conduct business without male guardianship, could serve as witnesses in legal proceedings, could inherit from their fathers and could pass property to their children, could sue and be sued in courts that treated them as legal persons rather than as property of husbands or fathers. I could in certain circumstances divorce husbands, though the conditions were more restrictive than those that allowed men to divorce wives. Women could serve as priestesses with significant economic and religious power, could hold positions in temple hierarchies that controlled vast resources, could participate in religious rituals that were essential to maintaining cosmic order, could in rare cases rule as queens or regents when no suitable male heir existed or when circumstances allowed or required female leadership. The evidence for women's agency comes from the administrative texts that document women as parties to contracts, from the legal texts that show women bringing cases or being sued, from the economic texts that record women owning businesses or managing estates, from the religious texts that name priestesses and describe their functions, from the literary texts that include female characters who speak and act with agency. Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who united Mesopotamia under Akkadian rule around 2334 BCE, was appointed high priestess of the moon god Nanna at held position of enormous religious and political importance, and became the world's first known author whose name is attached to literary compositions that survive and that can be attributed to her with reasonable confidence, that bear her name in the texts themselves rather than being anonymous works whose authorship is unknown. She composed hymns that praise the goddess Inanna in language that is both exalted and intimate, that demonstrate literary sophistication and emotional depth, that speak in first person about her devotion to the goddess and about her political struggles and her exile from and her eventual restoration to her position. Beneath the silence of the question whether Enheduanna actually composed these hymns herself, or whether they were written by scribes working under her direction or in her name, whether she was historical person or literary construction or combination of both, we find that the texts themselves testify to the possibility of female authorship in ancient Mesopotamia, demonstrate that women's voices could be preserved in writing even if they were exceptional rather than normal. Even if the vast majority of scribes and authors were male, even if the literary tradition was dominated by men who controlled education and who determined what was worth copying and preserving. The Ninmashara hymns attributed to Enheduanna praise Inanna in 4 to 2 stanzas that describe the goddess's various powers and manifestations, that identify Inanna with multiple aspects of divine feminine, with love and with war, with fertility and with destruction, with the planet Venus and with the storehouse, with everything that rises and sets and transforms, and that position Enheduanna herself as priestess who serves the goddess and who speaks for her, who mediates between divine and human realms, who uses poetic language to make theological statements, who creates literature that is simultaneously religious text and personal expression. Where memory fades into the other women whose names we know from economic and legal texts, the female merchants like Ami who traded in textiles, the priestesses who served various deities, the tavern keepers who ran the beer houses, the women who owned slaves and real estate, the mothers who made contracts regarding their children's futures, the widows who inherited property and managed it themselves, we find that Sumerian women had more agency than they would have in many subsequent periods. That the early civilization had not yet developed the strict gender hierarchies that would characterize later societies, that women could participate in economic and religious life in ways that would become increasingly restricted as patriarchal structures solidified. But we must also acknowledge the limitations. Women were not equal to men in Sumerian society, did not have the same opportunities or the same rights, were subject to double standards in laws regarding adultery and divorce, were valued primarily for their reproductive capacity and their domestic labor, were sometimes bought and sold as slaves or as wives in transactions that treated them as property. It experienced violence and exploitation that the legal texts document, even as they also document women's agency, experienced the limitations that all pre-modern societies imposed on women's autonomy. It is said that the women who served as Nadatu priestesses in later periods were consecrated to the god and were forbidden to marry or bear children, dedicated their lives to religious service, lived in cloisters, managed their own economic affairs including owning and renting property, bequeathed their wealth to other Nadatu or to their families, created alternative to marriage that was respectable, and that allowed some women to avoid the dangers of childbirth and the restrictions of marriage. That provided path for women whose families could afford the dedication fee and who preferred or accepted this life to the alternatives. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the women of Sumer speak through Enheduanna's hymns, through the economic texts that name them as property owners and merchants, through the legal texts that show them as litigants and witnesses, through the religious texts that identify them as priestesses, through everything that documents their presence and their agency, even in civilization that was patriarchal, but that was less restrictive than many that would follow. That allowed women more space and more voice than would be allowed in classical Greece or in medieval Europe, or in countless other societies that would pride themselves on their civilization while denying women the basic rights that Sumerian women possessed. Enheduanna's voice, speaking from 4,300 years ago, speaks for all the women whose voices were not preserved, whose stories were not written, whose agency was exercised but was not documented, whose lives were lived in the shadows of the historical record that privileged men's activities and men's achievements, whose presence we know existed but whose specifics we can only imagine, whose experiences shaped Sumerian civilization even though their contributions were undervalued and underrecorded, whose labor sustained the families and the economy and the society even though that labor was taken for granted, whose voices deserved to be heard and preserved but mostly were not, except for the exceptional few like Enheduanna who had the status and the access and the talent and the fortune to leave behind texts that bear her name, that allow her voice to speak still, that make her present to us across the millennia, that let us hear what Sumerian woman thought and felt and created, that testify that women were there, were active, were agents, were writers and rulers and servants of the gods, were property owners and merchants and priestesses, were human beings with full humanity even in society that did not always recognize or honor that humanity, were voices that deserve to be heard, that speak still through the fragments that survive. Through Enheduanna's hymns and through the economic texts and through the legal documents and through everything that preserves even briefly the presence of women in Sumer, in the first civilization, in the dust where the cities stood and where the women lived and worked and prayed and wrote and ruled and served and died and were buried and became dust like everyone becomes dust, but whose dust speaks still through the words that were written, through the names that were recorded, through the voices that were preserved even in fragments, even in echoes, even in the recognition that the women were there, were part of civilization's beginning, were builders and creators along with the men even if the men received more credit and more recognition, were essential even if undervalued, were human even if restricted, were voices even if often silenced, were present even if often ignored, were Sumerian women who ruled and wrote and served and who deserved to be remembered. And deserved to be heard, deserved to speak from the dust where they rest, where they wait, where they whisper still if we listen, if we read the texts, if we recognize their presence, if we honor their voices. If we remember that civilization was created not just by kings and priests and scribes who were mostly men, but also by the women who bore the children and brewed the beer and wove the textiles and managed households, and served the gods and wrote hymns and ruled when circumstances allowed, and who made civilization possible through their labor and their agency, even when that agency was constrained, even when that labor was undervalued. Even when the voices were rare and the names were exceptional and the preservation was accidental, even then the women were there, were Sumerian, were voices, were dust that speaks. The civilization that the Sumerians built in southern Mesopotamia depended entirely on their ability to control water through irrigation canals that brought the Tigris and Euphrates to fields that would otherwise be desert, through levees that protected settlements from floods that could destroy crops and drown cities, through systems of distribution that required constant maintenance and sophisticated coordination. Through engineering that transformed hostile environment into agricultural heartland, capable of supporting populations that reached into the hundreds of thousands, that created the surplus that funded temples and palaces and scribal schools and armies, that made urban life possible in region that nature had not designed for cities. That human ingenuity and labor and organization had bent to human purposes through the patient work of digging and maintaining the canals that carried life-giving water to the fields. The canals were marvels of engineering for their time, were precisely graded to ensure water flowed at correct speed too fast, and the current would erode the banks and the bottom, creating channels that deepened until they became ravines that could not be controlled. Too slow and the silt would settle and the canals would fill and would cease to function, would become muddy depressions rather than flowing waterways were equipped with regulators that controlled flow and with branches that distributed water to different fields, were managed by bureaucrats who allocated water rights and who resolved disputes between upstream users who wanted to divert more water and downstream users who complained that insufficient water was reaching their fields, who mediated conflicts that could escalate into violence when water scarcity made allocation matter of survival rather than merely matter of profit. Beneath the silence of the canal systems that can still be traced in satellite imagery, that show as lines across the desert where ancient watercourses ran, that mark the landscape with the ghost of Sumerian engineering, we can sense the enormous labor that irrigation required, the initial digging of the canals, the annual maintenance that cleared accumulated silt and repaired erosion damage and rebuilt sections that had collapsed, the constant vigilance that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic failures, the coordination of labor gangs that worked under supervision of temple or palace officials, the organization that mobilized thousands of workers for projects that benefited entire communities, but that required sacrifice from individuals who provided labor instead of working their own fields. But irrigation also carried curse within its blessing, contained the seeds of environmental disaster within the very system that made prosperity possible. The water that flowed through the canals and that soaked into the fields brought not just life-giving moisture, but also dissolved salts, minerals that were present in the river water in small concentrations, but that accumulated in the soil as the water evaporated, that increased year after year as irrigation continued, that gradually poisoned the fields and reduced their fertility, that made the soil progressively less productive until crops could no longer grow. Until the fields that had been gardens became wastelands, until the agricultural base that supported Sumerian civilization deteriorated beyond recovery. Where memory fades into the agricultural texts that document the slow catastrophe, that record decreasing barley yields over centuries, that show the shift from wheat cultivation to barley cultivation because barley is more salt-tolerant and could still produce crops in soil that had become too salty for wheat, that demonstrate through simple numbers the environmental degradation that irrigation was creating even as it sustained the civilization that depended on it. We find tragedy written in grain yields and in crop choices, find the end implicit in the beginning, find that the system that created Sumerian prosperity contained within itself the mechanism that would eventually destroy that prosperity. It is said that the Sumerian cities in southern Mesopotamia were abandoned one by one as the irrigation systems failed, and the soil became too salty to support agriculture, that the population shifted northward to regions where rainfall was higher and where irrigation was less necessary, and where the salt accumulation was therefore slower. That the tells that rise above the southern Iraqi desert mark where cities once stood and where fields once bloomed, but where nothing grows now except in the brief wet season when desert plants take advantage of rainwater that falls directly rather than depending on irrigation that no longer functions, that has not functioned for millennia, that left behind the salt-crusted earth that testifies to what irrigation achieved and what it destroyed. The curse was not immediate but was cumulative, was process that took centuries to render the fields infertile, was slow enough that each generation could believe the problem belonged to the future, could continue the practices that were making the disaster inevitable, could prioritize short-term yields over long-term sustainability, could focus on producing enough grain for this year without adequately considering what would happen to the soil after decades or centuries of intensive irrigation. The Sumerians were not ignorant of the salt problem. The texts document their awareness of soil salinity, describe fields as white. When the salt crust was visible on the surface, record attempts to manage the problem through allowing fields to lie fallow or through choosing salt-tolerant crops, but awareness did not translate into solution. Recognition did not prevent catastrophe. Knowledge that the system was unsustainable did not create ability to develop alternative system. The irrigation that blessed the Sumerians by making civilization possible cursed them by making that civilization temporary, by ensuring that the agricultural foundation would eventually fail, by creating prosperity that carried within it the mechanism of its own destruction. The fields that produced the surplus grain that fed the cities and that was stored in temple granaries, and that sustained the scribes and the priests and the craftsmen and all those who did not farm but who depended on farmers' labor, those fields gradually became less productive, gradually required more labor for less yield, gradually failed until they could no longer support the urban population, until the cities had to be abandoned or drastically reduced in size. Until Sumerian civilization in its southern heartland collapsed not through military conquest or political failure, but through environmental degradation, through the salt that accumulated in the soil, through the irrigation that blessed and cursed. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the canals speak through their traces in the landscape, through the abandoned fields that bear white crust of salt, through the texts that document declining yields, through the tells that mark where cities stood before the irrigation failed, and the people left, and the desert reclaimed what human labor had briefly transformed into gardens. The blessing and the curse were inseparable, were two aspects of single system, demonstrated that what sustains can also destroy, that what creates prosperity can also create disaster, that irrigation was necessary and was fatal, that the Sumerians could not have built their civilization without it and could not sustain their civilization with it, that they were trapped by their own success, that the very achievement that made them great contained the flaw that would bring them down. The dust that now covers the southern Mesopotamian plain, the salt that crusts the ancient fields, the canals that are traced in satellite images but that carry no water, the irrigation systems that failed millennia ago, all of these speak of the paradox at the heart of Sumerian civilization. Speak of the irrigation that made everything possible and that made nothing permanent, that blessed the fields with water and cursed them with salt, that created surplus and created scarcity. That built cities and destroyed their foundation, that demonstrates still that civilizations can undermine their own resource base, that short-term success can create long-term catastrophe, that the systems we create to sustain us can become the systems that destroy us, that irrigation blessed and cursed the Sumerians just as technology blesses and curses us. And just as our own systems for controlling nature and extracting resources carry within them the potential for disasters we cannot fully predict or prevent, just as the Sumerians who built the canals could not have foreseen the salt accumulation, or could not have prevented it even if they foresaw it. And just as we build and extract and consume while knowing or suspecting that we are creating problems for future generations, but not knowing how to stop or change or develop alternatives that would be sustainable, just as the blessing and the curse are intertwined, just as the irrigation that gave life also brought death. Just as the water flowed and the salt accumulated, and the civilization rose and fell and left behind the dust and the salt and the abandoned canals, and the voices that speak from clay tablets about barley yields and salt-damaged fields, and the irrigation that blessed and cursed, that made civilization and unmade it, that speaks still in the white-crusted earth, in the dry canals, in the tells where cities stood, in the silence where the water no longer flows, in the dust where the blessing became curse. Where the Sumerians learned what we are still learning. That what we build to sustain us can become what destroys us, that the systems have costs we do not always calculate, that irrigation blessed and cursed, that the dust remembers both, that the silence holds both, that the voice that speaks from the abandoned fields speaks of blessing and of curse, of water and of salt, of life and of death, of civilization and of collapse, of the Sumerians who built the canals and who left the salt, who blessed the earth with water and who cursed it with minerals, who created and destroyed through the same system, through the irrigation that made everything possible and that made nothing permanent, that blessed and cursed, that speaks still, that waits still in the dust, in the salt, in the silence where the canals once flowed and where now only memory flows, only recognition flows, only the understanding that blessing and curse were one, were irrigation, were the system that sustained and destroyed, were the Sumerian achievement and Sumerian tragedy. Were what made them great and what made them fall, were the water and the salt, were the blessing and the curse. Unlike the Egyptians who developed elaborate theology of the afterlife with possibilities for continued existence and even pleasure, who believed that proper mummification and proper burial and sufficient grave goods could ensure comfort in the next world, who imagined the deceased being judged and either admitted to the field of reeds where they would enjoy eternal abundance, or being devoured by Ammit if they failed the weighing of the heart. The Sumerians imagined death as descent to dark underworld called Kur or Urkala, where all the dead regardless of status or virtue dwelt as shadows, as diminished versions of their living selves, where they existed in perpetual gloom eating dust and clay, where there was no judgment based on moral behavior during life, where noble and commoner alike experienced the same dreary fate, where the only distinctions were that those who had been properly buried and who had surviving offspring to pour libations and make offerings were slightly better off than those who lacked these provisions, who were condemned to even worse existence as restless ghosts who might return to trouble the living. The Descent of Inanna tells how even the great goddess of love and war must submit to death's power, must descend through the 7 gates of the underworld, must remove at each gate one of the garments and the insignia of her divine power until she arrives naked and powerless before her sister Ereshkigal, who rules the land of no return, who judges her and transforms her into corpse hanging on a hook, who demonstrates that death claims even gods, that the underworld is realm from which none can escape except through extraordinary divine intervention that required Enki's cunning, and that left Inanna able to return only by providing substitute to take her place, only by condemning her husband Dumuzi to spend half the year in the underworld while she remained above. Beneath the silence of the theology that offered so little comfort, that promised no reward for virtue or for service to the gods, that made death into ending rather than into transformation, that reduced human existence to brief span of years above ground followed by eternal existence as shadow and darkness, we can sense the bleakness of Sumerian eschatology, the resignation to mortality as diminishment rather than as transition to better state, the absence of hope for meaningful continued existence. The recognition that death was loss, was deprivation, was descent into realm where nothing good awaited, where the best one could hope for was to be remembered by the living and to receive offerings that would make shadowy existence slightly less miserable. The underworld was described in terms that emphasized its horror. It was the land of no return, the house of darkness, the road from which there is no way back, the place where they see no light, they dwell in darkness, where dust is their food, clay their bread, where they are clothed like birds with garments of wings, where the dead existed in state that was neither living nor truly dead but was something worse than either, was existence stripped of everything that made life worth living. Stripped of pleasure and purpose and hope and change, and everything except awareness of loss and deprivation, and the eternal monotony of darkness. Where memory fades into the rituals that were performed for the dead, into the offerings that were left at graves, into the libations that were poured and the prayers that were spoken to sustain the deceased in their shadowy existence. We find that Sumerian burial practices emphasized continuity between living and dead, emphasized ongoing relationship where the living had obligations to the dead and the dead could affect the living, where neglected ancestors could become dangerous ghosts. Where proper funeral rites and regular offerings were necessary not just to honor the dead, but to protect the living from their potential malevolence. The graves that have been excavated show that the Sumerians buried their dead with provisions for the journey to the underworld and for existence their food and drink, personal possessions, tools and weapons, jewelry and cosmetic items, cylinder seals and clay tablets, everything that the deceased might need or that expressed their status and identity. Everything that demonstrated that the living cared about the dead and wanted to ease their transition to the underworld, even if that underworld offered no real comfort, even if the provisions were gestures that could not fundamentally alter the grim reality that all the dead faced. It is said that the bleakness of Sumerian afterlife beliefs helps explain why Gilgamesh sought immortality so desperately in the epic that bears his name, why the death of his friend Enkidu provoked such existential crisis, why Gilgamesh could not accept that he too must die and descend to the house of dust, why he traveled to the ends of the earth seeking Utnapishtim, who had survived the flood and who had been granted eternal life. Why he was willing to endure any hardship to avoid the descent that awaited all mortals. Why, when he finally accepted that immortality was impossible, he found some consolation in the works he had built, in the walls of Uruk that would outlast his body, in the fame that would preserve his name even when his flesh had turned to dust. The afterlife where nothing awaited except dust and darkness and eternal diminishment speaks to us still about how the Sumerians understood mortality, about why achievements in this life mattered so much when there was nothing to look forward to in the next life, about why building monuments and writing inscriptions and creating works that would outlast individual lifetime seemed so important. About why fame and remembrance were the only forms of immortality available to mortals who could not avoid death, but who could potentially avoid being forgotten, who could create legacies that would speak their names when their bodies were silent, who could build cities and write poems and establish laws that would testify to their existence long after that existence had ended in the house of dust. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And the underworld speaks through the myths that describe it, through the burial goods that testify to concern for the dead, through the offerings that were made at graves, through the resignation and the bleakness that pervades Sumerian thoughts about death, through the recognition that this life was all there was and that death was loss that could not be recovered, that could only be anticipated with dread and accepted with resignation, that could not be avoided but that could perhaps be delayed. That made every year of life precious because it was year not spent in the house of dust, year above ground in sunlight rather than below ground in darkness, year of eating bread and drinking beer rather than eating dust and drinking nothing, year of being alive rather than being shadow. The dust where the Sumerians are buried, the graves that hold their bones and their grave goods, the tells that cover the cities where they lived before they died and descended to the underworld that they believed awaited them. All of these testify to civilization that faced mortality without illusions, that did not comfort itself with promises of paradise or resurrection, that acknowledged death as ending rather than as transformation, that found meaning in life precisely because death offered no meaning. That built and created and achieved precisely because there was no afterlife where achievements would matter, that understood that the only immortality available was through works that outlasted the body, through names that were remembered, through voices that were preserved in clay tablets, through the dust that held what remained when life ended, when the descent began, when the shadows gathered, when nothing awaited except the eternal darkness, the eternal dust, the eternal diminishment. The house of no return where all the Sumerians have gone, where they wait in the darkness if they wait at all, where they eat dust if they eat at all, where they remember life if they remember at all, where nothing awaits them except what we give them through remembering, through reading their tablets, through speaking their names, through recognizing that they lived and built and created despite knowing or believing that death was the end, was the descent, was the dust, was nothing except dust. Was the silence where voices go when they stop speaking, was the darkness where light goes when it is extinguished, was the house of no return where the Sumerians believed they would go and where they have gone, into the dust, into the darkness, into the silence, into the nothing that awaited them, into the afterlife where nothing awaited except what we create through memory, through the voices we recover from clay tablets, through the recognition that they existed, that they mattered. That their dust speaks still even if they believed it would not, even if they thought death was ending rather than transformation into voice from dust, into presence through absence, into immortality through clay tablets and through the memories we preserve, through speaking their names. Gilgamesh and Enkidu, Inanna and Ereshkigal, Ziusudra and Enheduanna, all the names and all the unnamed, all who lived in Sumer and who died and who descended to the house of dust, who wait there still if waiting is possible, who speak from there still through the tablets they left behind, who achieved the immortality they thought impossible by writing on clay that endured, by creating civilization that speaks still, by building the dust that holds their voices. By making the afterlife where nothing awaited into the afterlife where everything that matters awaits the voices, the names, the achievements, the civilization, the memory, the recognition, the immortality that comes not through existing forever but through being remembered, through speaking still, through the dust that holds the voice, through the silence that preserves the echo, through the afterlife where nothing awaited but where everything remains. The Sumerian as spoken language probably ceased to be anyone's mother tongue sometime in the early 2nd millennium BCE, was replaced in daily speech by Akkadian, which was Semitic language related to Hebrew and Arabic, which was spoken by people who had lived alongside the Sumerians in Mesopotamia for centuries, who had gradually become more numerous or more powerful or simply more culturally dominant, until their language became the language of daily communication, while Sumerian retreated into specialized domains, into religious rituals and scholarly texts and legal formulae, and the classical literature that was studied in scribal schools, but that was no longer part of living oral tradition. It was no longer language that mothers spoke to children, or that merchants used in the marketplace, or that friends spoke to each other in casual conversation. But Sumerian did not die completely, did not disappear when it ceased to be spoken natively, continued instead to be written and studied and copied for another 2,000 years, became classical language like Latin would later become in medieval Europe or like Sanskrit became in India, was language of scholarship and religion and prestige, was mastered by educated elite who learned it as second language through years of study in scribal schools. Who could read the ancient tablets and who could compose new texts in Sumerian even though they spoke Akkadian at home? Who preserved the literary traditions, and who ensured that Sumerian texts continued to be transmitted across centuries and eventually across millennia until modern scholars could recover them and could learn to read them again after the knowledge of Sumerian had been lost for 2,000 years, following the end of cuneiform writing in the 1st century CE. Beneath the silence of the transition from living language to dead language, from speech that was learned naturally through immersion to text that was learned artificially through instruction, we can sense what was lost when Sumerian ceased to be spoken, the nuances and the idioms and the oral traditions that existed alongside the written tradition, the jokes and the curses and the intimate conversations and everything that happens in language but that is not written down. That depends on living community of speakers who share understanding that transcends what can be captured in writing, that is passed from generation to generation through speech rather than through text, that dies when the last native speakers die and when no children learn the language as their mother tongue. The bilingual texts from the period after Sumerian had ceased to be spoken natively testify to its continued importance, and to the challenges of transmitting it. Tablets that present Sumerian on one side or in one column and Akkadian translation on the other side or in parallel column, that function as teaching tools for scribal students and as reference works for those who needed to consult Sumerian texts but whose native language was Akkadian. That allow modern scholars to understand Sumerian by using Akkadian as key, by comparing the two versions and inferring meanings and grammatical structures that would be difficult or impossible to determine from Sumerian texts alone. Where memory fades into the question of how accurate these translations were, whether the Akkadian scribes who created them fully understood the Sumerian they were translating, or whether they sometimes guessed or made mistakes, whether they preserved the original meanings or distorted them, we find that the bilingual texts are invaluable but also problematic. Are our best source for understanding Sumerian, but are also potentially misleading because we cannot always be certain that the Akkadian accurately represents what the Sumerian meant, because translation always involves interpretation and sometimes involves misunderstanding, because the gap between languages is not always fully bridgeable, especially when one of the languages is dead, and has no native speakers who can be consulted. It is said that Sumerian continued to be studied in Mesopotamia until the very end of cuneiform writing, that scribes in the 1st century CE were still copying Sumerian literary texts and creating new Sumerian compositions, that the language had been dead for 2 millennia but was still being written, still being taught, still being valued as classical language that connected later Mesopotamian civilizations to their cultural origins. That preserved wisdom and literature from the earliest period of writing, that demonstrated continuity across the millennia, even as political power shifted from Sumerians to Akkadians to Babylonians to Assyrians to Persians to Greeks to Parthians. The death of Sumerian as spoken language meant the loss of connection to oral tradition, meant that Sumerian literature became fixed text rather than performance that could adapt and change with each retelling, meant that the living tradition became museum piece, became artifact to be studied rather than art to be practiced, became monument to past rather than resource for present. But it also meant that Sumerian was preserved in forms that might not have survived if it had remained only spoken language, that the literary texts were copied and studied and transmitted precisely because they were classical texts in dead language, that they were valued for their antiquity and their association with the origins of civilization. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And Sumerian speaks still through the tablets, through the texts that have been preserved and translated, through the lexical lists and the literary compositions and the hymns and the myths and the legal documents and the administrative texts, through everything that was written in the language and that has survived to be read by modern scholars who have learned to decipher cuneiform and who have reconstructed Sumerian grammar and vocabulary from the tablets that preserve it, who have made the dead language speak again by reading what the ancient scribes wrote, by translating what they cannot hear spoken but what they can see written, by recovering the voices that were silenced 2,000 years ago when the last person who could speak Sumerian natively died. The language that faded into Akkadian faded but did not disappear, became specialized register rather than general language, became classical tongue rather than living speech, became text rather than talk, became what priests recited and what scholars studied rather than what anyone actually spoke in their homes or in the streets or in the fields, became language of past rather than language of present, became Sumerian as it exists for us now, entirely textual, entirely mediated through writing, entirely dependent on translation because none of us speaks it natively, none of us learned it from our mothers, none of us can hear it except in our reconstructed pronunciation that is probably incorrect in many details. None of us can know what it really sounded like when it was living language, when it was spoken by the Sumerians who built the first cities and who invented writing and who created civilization. The fading happened gradually over centuries, happened as fewer children learned Sumerian as their first language, as more people spoke Akkadian at home even if they used Sumerian in temple or in court, as the domains where Sumerian was appropriate contracted until it existed only in specialized contexts, until it became language that everyone recognized as important and ancient and prestigious, but that no one spoke ordinarily. That existed only in its written form and in the oral recitation of that written form, but not as living speech that generated new expressions and that adapted to changing circumstances, and that evolved the way living languages evolve. The fading was loss but was also preservation, was death that paradoxically ensured survival, was transformation from living language that would have continued to change and eventually would have become something different into dead language that remained frozen at the moment it died, and that could therefore be preserved and studied and transmitted without the alterations that living speech inevitably undergoes. The dust where Sumerian was spoken is dust that holds no sound, holds no voices except what we recreate through reading the tablets aloud in pronunciation that we hope approximates what the Sumerians would have recognized. Holds only the silence where the language was spoken and then was not spoken, where it faded into Akkadian, where it became classical language and then became dead language, and then became language that had to be rediscovered and deciphered and learned again from the tablets. Where it waits still in the cuneiform marks, where it speaks still to those who learn to read it, where it testifies that languages die but writing preserves, that speech fades but text endures, that the voices that stopped speaking can speak again through clay tablets, through the marks that outlasted the sounds, through the written Sumerian that survived even though spoken Sumerian died, through the language that faded into Akkadian but that did not disappear completely, that remained in the tablets. That waits in the museums and the publications and the databases, that speaks through translations and through scholarly articles and through the ongoing work of decipherment. That demonstrates that what is written can outlast what is spoken, that the clay tablets preserve what memory forgets, that the fading was not ending but was transformation, was change from one form of existence to another, was the language becoming text, becoming voice from dust, becoming Sumerian as we know it now entirely textual. Entirely historical, entirely dependent on the tablets that the ancient scribes wrote and that modern scholars read. Entirely the language that faded into Akkadian but that speaks still, that echoes still, that waits still to be read, to be translated, to be heard again, even if hearing is through reading, even if the voice is reconstructed, even if the sound is approximation, even if we can never know exactly what Sumerian sounded like when it was living language, we can read what it meant. We can understand what it said, we can hear the voices through the tablets, we can make the faded language speak again, we can recover what was lost or what seemed lost. We can bring back from the dust the language that the dust holds, that speaks still if we listen, if we read, if we attend to the tablets, if we honor the Sumerian that faded into Akkadian but that did not die completely, that survived in writing, that speaks still. In modern Iraq, where the ancient Sumerian cities lie as tells rising from the desert, where the Tigris and Euphrates still flow but not always where they flowed in ancient times, where the irrigation systems that made Sumerian civilization possible have long since failed and where the fields that once bloomed are now salt-crusted wasteland, where the temples have crumbled to foundations and where the ziggurats have eroded to shapeless mounds. where the cities that housed tens of thousands are now archaeological sites visited by the few who can reach them in country that has been devastated by wars and sanctions and instability. The past and the present exist in complicated relationship shaped by violence and politics, and the contested nature of heritage in region where multiple modern nations claim descent from ancient civilizations, and where the artifacts are sometimes protected and sometimes looted, and where archaeology has been sometimes permitted and sometimes impossible depending on security situation and political circumstances. The tells themselves and Uruk, Eridu and Nippur, Lagash and Larsa and Kish rise like witnesses from the flat landscape, like artificial hills where no natural hills exist, like graves containing the compressed remains of multiple cities built one on top of another across millennia, like palimpsests where each layer holds different chapter of the same ongoing story, like time made visible through stratigraphy, through the vertical arrangement of ruins that shows which came first and which came later. Through the pottery sequences and the architectural styles and the tablets that can be dated and that allow archaeologists to reconstruct the chronology, to put the pieces in order, to tell the story of how the cities rose and fell and rose again, of how civilization began and developed and transformed and eventually declined, of how the Sumerians created the first cities and how those cities were eventually abandoned and covered by sand and forgot until modern archaeology recovered them. Beneath the silence of the sites as they exist today, some excavated and studied and published, others only partially investigated, still others unexcavated and waiting for future archaeologists, all of them vulnerable to looting and to environmental damage and to the conflicts that have made Iraq dangerous for the kind of sustained, careful excavation that archaeology requires. We can contemplate the distance between what was and what remains, between the living cities and the dead tells. Between Sumerian voices speaking in crowded streets and the silence of the ruins, between civilization at its height and civilization reduced to archaeological data, between the presence that the Sumerians were and the absence that they have become except in the fragments that survive, in the tablets that preserve their words, in the artifacts that testify to their material culture. The excavations that have been conducted, beginning in the 19th century and continuing sporadically when circumstances permit, have recovered vast quantities of material, hundreds of thousands of clay tablets, countless pottery vessels and tools and weapons and jewelry and cylinder seals and sculptures and architectural remains and human remains, and everything that accumulates in cities where people live for millennia, everything that gets broken and discarded and buried. Everything that the cities contained when they were living and that the tells contain now that the cities are dead. The material fills museums in Iraq and in Europe and in America, is studied by specialists who publish their findings in scholarly journals, becomes data that supports historical reconstructions, and that tests hypotheses about how Sumerian society functioned. Where memory fades into the question of what has been lost to looting and to the conflicts that have made preservation difficult, into the incalculable damage that has occurred when sites have been bulldozed or when museums have been looted, or when tablets have been illegally excavated and sold on the black market, and thereby removed from their archaeological context that would have provided information about dating and provenance and association with other artifacts. We find that much of Sumerian material culture has been destroyed or dispersed or lost, that we possess only fraction of what once existed, that our understanding is based on incomplete evidence, that the voices we hear from the tablets are minority voices that happened to survive when countless other voices were silenced forever, when their tablets were broken or dissolved or burned or simply lost. It is said that the Tell of Uruk, where some of the earliest writing was discovered and where the first monumental architecture was built, where the city that gave its name to the entire region existed for millennia as one of Mesopotamia's most important urban centers, rises from the Iraqi desert like testimony to what the Sumerians achieved, like monument that is simultaneously preservation and destruction, like place where the past is both accessible and lost, both present and absent, both speaking and silent. The excavations at Uruk have revealed the White Temple and the Ina precinct and tablets documenting early writing and countless other remains that testify to the city's importance and its longevity. But they have also revealed the limitations of archaeology, the fact that excavation is destruction, that digging up the tell to study what it contains means destroying the stratigraphy that provides context. It means making choices about what to excavate and what to leave for future archaeologists with better techniques, means accepting that we can never recover everything, that much will remain forever buried, that the dust holds secrets that we will never access. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. And in the dust where the Sumerians created writing and cities and irrigation and mathematics and astronomy and literature and law and beer and everything else that defines civilization as we understand it, where they pressed marks into clay that hardened into permanent record, where they built cities from reed and mud brick, where they dug canals and raised ziggurats, where they lived and died and became the foundation upon which later civilizations built. Where they invented what we take for granted, there the voices speak still if we attend to them. If we read the tablets, if we study the archaeology, if we recognize that we are all the Sumerians' heirs, that civilization as we know it began in southern Mesopotamia 5,000 years ago, that the wedge-shaped marks are ancestors of all writing systems, that the first cities are models for all cities, that the irrigation that blessed and cursed the Sumerians teaches us about our own relationship with technology and environment. The dust where civilization was born is sacred dust, holds the voices of the first people to write, the first people to live in cities, the first people to create the institutions and technologies that made complex society possible, holds Gilgamesh seeking immortality and Enheduanna praising Inanna, holds the kings in their death pits and the workers drinking beer, holds the scribes counting grain and the astronomers tracking Venus, holds the priests serving the gods and the merchants conducting trade, holds everyone who lived in Sumer and who made Sumer what it was, holds their achievements and their failures, their brilliance and their blind spots, their creation of civilization and their destruction of their environmental base, holds everything that made them first and everything that made them temporary, holds the voices that speak from clay tablets and the silence that covers everything the tablets do not preserve. It holds the memory and the forgetting, holds the past and the fragments of past that survive into present. The civilization that was born in the dust has returned to dust, has left behind the tells and the tablets, has left behind the voices that speak through wedge-shaped marks, has left behind the first words and the first cities and the first laws and the first literature, has left behind the beginning, has left behind everything that came first and that therefore made everything that came later possible, has left behind Sumer in the dust where it began, where it flourished, where it declined, where it fell. Where it was covered by sand, where it was forgotten, where it was rediscovered, where it speaks still to anyone who will listen, who will read the tablets, who will visit the tells, who will recognize that we stand on Sumerian foundations even when we do not acknowledge it, that we write with tools the Sumerians invented, that we live in cities the Sumerians pioneered, that we organize society using principles the Sumerians developed. That we are connected across 5 millennia to the people who first created what we call civilization, who first wrote on clay, who first built urban landscapes, who first made permanent record of human thought. The dust speaks if we listen. The tablets preserve if we read, the voices echo if we attend. The Sumerians wait in the dust where civilization was born, wait in the tells that hold their cities, wait in the clay that holds their words, wait in the silence that holds their voices, wait for us to remember, to recognize, to honor, to understand that they were first, that they created what we inherited, that the dust where they lie is dust that holds the foundation, the beginning, the first civilization. The voices that speak still about gods and kings and beer and irrigation and writing and astronomy and everything that made them Sumerian, everything that made them first, everything that made them worthy of memory, worthy of study, worthy of recognition as our ancestors in civilization. As the voices from the dust, as the people who were born in Mesopotamia and who built cities and who wrote on clay and who created from nothing everything that defines civilization. Who made possible everything that came after, who speak still from the dust where civilization was born, where it began, where it speaks still, where the Sumerians wait, where the voices echo, where the clay tablets preserve, where the wedge-shaped marks proclaim still across 5 millennia. We were first, we built the cities, we created writing, we began civilization, we are Sumerian, we speak from dust, we wait in the tells, we live in the tablets. We echo in the voices that remember us, that read our words, that recognize that civilization was born here, in this dust, in these cities, in this land between the rivers where we pressed marks into clay and thereby made history possible, where we built from reed and mud brick and thereby made cities possible, where we dug canals and thereby made irrigation possible, where we served the gods and thereby made civilization possible, where we lived and died and became dust and where the dust speaks still, speaks of beginning, speaks of first, speaks of Sumer, speaks of civilization born in dust, speaking still from dust, waiting still in dust, the sacred dust where it all began. The end.